yomu kubayambako Mami Museveni okulaba ng'ekyamazima bawamba kabamba yamuwako ku mmundu ezimu yamukuŋŋanyizako ku mmundu ezimu kale wama omwana agambye 24 regents yewayi bakongerako omanyika kati ndudde okubigoberera Rashiki agambye waliyo ne 24 regents mbadde ekyamazima sigimanyi ono agambye live in Tabaku Saudi Arabia bangambye enkuba eyiika mu kyondo kya Buwarabu ennaku zino etonnya obukufu obufi ani alinnya mu netiwaka zange abaana ba online ani agala okubeera ng'ateeka kati akyankalanya amayengo wama kale tugenda kubeera ng'ekyamazima ensonga tuzitambuza mpola mpola nkutegeeza nti Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Bobi Wine ekyamazima tutandikira Uganda byonna tubikole byonna tubyogere ekyamazima mwami Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert akyagenda maaso ekyamazima n'okubeera ng'abikola alina olukuŋŋaana lwagenda okubeera ng'ekyamazima yeetabamu mu Washington DC naku z'omwezi 26 lunaku lwankya mpuliriza ssaawa zigenda kubeera 11 ez'akawungeezi paka ssaawa emu ey'olweggulo agenda kubeera ng'ekyamazima ayogerako eri ensi ngenda kujja nkubuulire omulamwa guleko ki Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Bobi Wine alondeddwa okugenda okudisikasinga ku ddembe ly'abuntu mu Washington District of Columbia that is Washington DC amawulire geetoololera ku mwana ono bannaye amawulire gamwetoololerako okufa obufya mpuliriza nkutegeezezza abadde ku France 24 kakati ate wuuno amawulire gatulaga nti ekyamazima agenda kubeera mu lukuŋŋaana olw'okwogera ku ddembe ly'obuntu mu Washington DC yite Washington District of Columbia omwana agambye let us give this guy a lion baba teekako empologoma ezo ziba miliyoni 2 teekako empologoma Nowa wako agambye omusajja tumuwe ekiwologoma wano kulayi yiwayo ekiwologoma owulire kakati embeera bwetabuka wano oba shongikomye wano kale wama njagala okwebaza bonna abagenda okunkwasizako ku charity gye ngenda okubeera nga nkola bannange ngenda maaso n'okubeera nga mbeebaza bannayuganda mikwano gyange abagobera puroguramu omulongooti navayo ne mbasaba nti ekyamazima nsaba munnyambeko munkwasizeeko ngende nzire ku ssomero gye nasomera primary omwana wuuno alabye ku live n'agamba let us give him a lion omanyi kye kitegeeza sudayisi omwana agambye bampe ekiwologoma mu birabu ezo ziba miliyoni 2 ku live kakati wamma weebale kubeera ng'ekyamazima kwoli alabye waka nakkiriza n'agamba nti yesu omusajja tumuwe kakati ampuliriza badde mbategeeza njagala okwebaza mwenna bannayuganda mikwano gya puroguramu omulongooti abali mu kunkwasisaako omulimu gw'okulabikanga enzirayo ku primary school yange gye nasomera myaka 7 kuva 2 paka 2010 ne malirayo P7 gye natandikira CP1 ekyamazima nabagamba njagala kudda gye nava I want to go back to my roots abajjukira Michael Jackson brother Lucky Dube akayima kabaita back to my roots kati nange njagala kuddayo gye natandikira primary ekyamazima abaana embeera mwe basomera sinnungi ba OBZ bange ne ba OGZ mu primary gye basomera enfuufu twagala tugibawonye mu bibiina njagala omwana ave ewaka ng'agenda mu kirasa asome adde ewaka nga bwe yagenze ng'enfuufu talinga ava mu nnimiro ekyo babeere nga bakinzijukirako kakati nampuliriza nabagamba abagala okunkwasizaako mwenna njagala sementi na musenyu ebisigadde tunaabirabira eyo naye nga ku sementi n'omusenyu kwe tutava ensawo 7 kaka twakawezako ensawo 15 tutambudde sudayisi twakawezako ensawo 15 tubuza ensawo 5 omusenyu waliwo omwami eyampadde trip 2 eza flowa yaŋŋambye ali mu bitundu byeno ali mu bitundu bayaŋŋambye bakayita batya akatundu oyita waneeno ekikona ne weeyongerako munda eyo ngenda kukebera ku kitabo kyange yaŋŋambye sebo nkuwadde omusenyu agambye go to my video and see the first video go to my TikTok and see the first video bwatyo bwagambye ampuliriza bagambye mugende ku TikTok yange mulabe video esooka kale nno onagamba nti live from Accra Ghana Ntumbudde leero TikTok ya leero ngegenda kunyuma wama Bahrain twali mu kyondo kya Buwarabi abo bali mu kwekuba kugambye olunaku olwajja abasajja bakubye ekibuga Baghdad Iraq bulijjo ebadde erinnya sayidi 2 kakati bwe ffe baali basoma divinity okubeera ng'oli kirumirira mpiyo bbiri twagiyitanga syncretism oli nyeeno neeno kakati eggwanga Sudaisa anyenya mutwe agamba akasajja ebintu oba kabijjawa mu divinity syncretism kwe kubeera ng'ekyamazima osinza Katonda ne sitaani kakati Iraka ebadde esinza Katonda ne sitaani omuyiraani yagikubye Bagidadi n'agikuba kakati bamukwatidde mu transit asala ave nadde ne bakuba ampuliriza bugenzo okutyona kulwalira abasajja abayiraani balonze omuwandiisi wa supreme leader omupya oluvannyuma lw'okutta Ali Lalijan abasajja balonze omulala ampuliriza Trump agambye enjogerezeganya zikyagenda mu maaso kyondo kya Buwarabu gye tuli ampuliriza abagambye enjogerezeganya zikyagenda mu maaso Iran egenda maaso etegeeza ensi nti bannange nedda enjogerezeganya ffe tutuziriimu walibanga America bane mu kugisiba katambaala ku maaso ono agambye I'm in USA Texas proudly African bwatyo bwagambye agambye nti mu Uganda empya baba lufumo bwatyo bwagambye n'agamba nti ono unategeeza nti no live ni pious no chairperson kyegegwa kwendi baba abaana batandise okukasuka ebirabo kakati batandise okukasuka ebirabo bagambye omusajja tumuwe empologoma wama abali ku TikTok live nabagambye kakati abagala okunkwasisako ku charity yange enamba zolabaawo waggulu kukasitika zezange mumanya ga Fred Sewajje njagala ngendo tuuka omwezi ogwokulangina kuza omwezi 2 oba 18 ensonga nzimaliriza ono agambye izi mu 7 siiki oba nedda twakomye kumulaba ku weekend ngali munda mu ggwanga lya Kenya mpuliriza waliwo ebifaananyi ebitambuzibwa ku mukutu gumugatta abantu Uganda nedda bakulu teri asobola kutta kifaananyi bwe kityo omanyi nagenda ne mbategeeza gye buvuddeko mwavayo ne mulaba ekifaananyi kya Mojitaba Khamenei nga bakulaga talina kugulu bakulaga aliko kanula bamusibye bandage ne mbagamba kakati mu mateeka g'abasajja abawarabiya mu sharia law kizibu nnyo abasajja abayiraani nga bamuwa obukuumi obw'amaanyi okufulumya ekifaananyi kye ng'ali bw'atyo baba batyobodde ekitiibwa kye kakati nawano kizibu nnyo bana bafulumya ekifaananyi kya Mwami Museveni nga balaga aliko oxygen oba wakirabye Sudaisi wakirabye abaana bakedde kitambuza naye njagala okutegeeza nti that is artificial intelligence kifaananyi ekyo si kituufu baaba ono agambye amukaming tumubende Selekita Savio tukwaniriza ono agambye nti tuweeko agadi RC live from Kigali Rwanda bwatyo bwagambye weebale kutuweereza e Dubai kwendi ntumbudde Daddy Princess Fabius bwatyo bwagambye kakati kale wamampuliriza ku noti 75 nsoma studio lines mulimu abankubira nga bagamba tuwe ku namba ya radio kati njisoma kwata peno olupapula nzija kugisoma bemala okugisoma tutandikira Wakyagulanyi France 24 interview gyakoze ampuliriza ekyamazima egowinze vayiro amusajja abadde areasonize highly ngenda kujja njikuwe dakiika 10 zonna nga bwazikoze tetugenda kumenya muwadde wabula tugenda ku interpreting kwabyo abyogedde mu luzungu ate nabagamba bwekituuka ku interpretation awo mundeke ndi kabaka nange nekakasa awo mukuvuunula ekyamazima nekakasaawo mu bimu ku mitu binasinga okumastalinga kwe kuvuunula kale abaliko ku online n'abali ku FM musoke mumbulire obanga ekyamazima amayingo gafuluma bulungi nnyo nnyini ddala 15 katonyezemu mumbulire begaba gafuluma bulungi ensonga mbeere nga zitandika wangi munaayi okuliza baaba
Musajja wa Kabaka Kabuye Ronald
esebo
tuwanika abalungi nabingoola
esebo
mayengo gafuluma bulungi
nabingoola gafuluma kale mwebale nnyo mwebalire ddala wangi munaayi wangi baaba okuwuliriza baaba
mumagisega wangandika sambya
esebo
amayengo gafulumira ddala baaba
weebale nnyo webalire ddala omwana wo nazina ngamba baaba oli watabu bamuyise DJ Kamoga Yugi bwatyo bwagambye ono agambye baba amukaming tumubende live from Riyadh Saudi Arabia bangambye ekiri yenkuba eyiika bananga bakuba kusimu yange ey'omu ngalo sisobola gye kuwatanga ndi ku mpewo ekyo omala biseera oba omala byambulago ng'alingiza muzibe wangi munaayi ate abaana akulaba abayi muzibe okuwuliriza muganda wange esebo lw'emiyaga Okay, webale nnyo webale ddala Musisi Emmanuel agambye alikata Bobi is our savior Rahimu n'agamba Mbale we are there Abu Dhabi live oyo bamuyise lwabatungi Ruishe bwatyo bwagambye nze nakirabyeko bulo ekifaananyi Selector Brands agambye yekirabyeko ekifaananyi kigedde kutambula kizunga live from Kawempe Republic nkwota buliro webale kubeera nga kwoli mu bitundu by'e Kawempe ono najja n'ategeeza ekyamazima very well bro Fiki n'agamba nnyo ono n'agamba nti gafuluma bulungi nnyini ddala engineer Andrew kale wama munzikirize kakati abaana abagiriko abaliko online n'abali ku FM munzikirize mumpeemu eddakiika just emu bbiri zokka nzimala okugyawo buno obulangu wa traffic tankwata nti nabukutte kakati bwe mala okugyawo obulangu buno just 2 minutes nzije tutandikira Wakyagulanyi Setamu Robert ebigambo byayogedde ekyamazima bikankanyiza ensi ate abadde yakava ku France 24 bwati ne tufuna invitation ye bamuwadde invite agenda kwogera mu lukuŋŋaana lw'eddembe ly'obuntu mu Washington District of Columbia gwanga lya America mpuliriza abasajja bamugambye sebo taata tusensebuse jangu bamugambye taata Kyagulanyi Sentamu gunde tusensebuse tunagundagundanga babiri Abamerika bamugambye newankubadde bamonna mu ggwanga lya Uganda tugenda kugundagundanga babiri sebo taata tusensebuse jangu oyogereko mu lukuŋŋaana lw'eddembe ly'obuntu mu Washington DC kale byonna tugenda kubeera ng'ekyamazima obisubwa abagamba there is nothing sweeter than omulongooti ezimu ku programu zenkola ng'ekyamazima mpulira nenganga gwe bagambye nti kakati omanyi 1+1 equals omu nagamba 11 omulala nagamba 2 kakati buli omu agenda ogireeta ngaga ogambye nga emungi gattekeemu kati nze nzijewuka plus nendaba nga ziri 11 omulala naga nze ndaba ziri 2 kale niyo kalijula mu bweto kakati awo bakugezesiza obwongo ampuliriza munzikirize mpumulemu katini nnyo bwenti bwe mala okuwumulamu katini nnyo omwana eyansuubiza ekiwologoma nga sinnakiraba omwana w'ekiwologoma ku live nga sinnakiraba mpe empologoma nze nyinyuke ate tunaabeera awo mba ngenze gula ensawo za simenti nga 20 Silivia Waiso agambye waali atumbudde Yosem agambye sewajja ekyanja ewa Ssebuki waliyo mwaka kitobeeranga twaliyo fina nedda waliyo just mikwano gyange waliyo mikwano gyange nze nabeeranga nsoma 2017 2018 2019 we nasomera just waliyo mikwano gyange Dani Rutwama ngambye why yoli otumbudde bamwise Yosam yangbuuziza bwati ewa Pastor Elijah Subuchusali yo just waliyo mikwano gyange Alexander watching in South Sudan kwati bwagambye I congratulate you Fred Dr. Love Kalungi angambye I congratulate you Fred mumpe ekiwologoma nammweze nyinyuke ngende ngulira abaana semiti kusomero gye nasomera awo kakati mba ngenda bugenzi mbagambirawo Eliana olinayo ensawo ya meka nti 3 nti milioni 2 za sente meka za nsawo meka awo nga tugenda ng'ekyo kiggwa mpuliriza kale kankolemu katini nnyo bwenti bwe mala okulamu katini nnyo bwenti agamba te muganda wange Aluna Kabali angambye kwali tuyisaamu eggaali manager Sam Sebo nkutumiddeko nnyo nnyini ddala ndabirabo kona naye tumutumidde jjajja kikona naye tumutumidde kale mwama mpuliriza munzikirize abaana ba bodaboda banange ekyamazima bo ensonga bazikwasaganya ekibuga Mubende enkuba ekedde kutonya naye kyemmanyi etonnya eggwanga Uganda lyonna enyinza okubeera nga mbategeeza kubanga ekyamazima eyiise ngenze ne ŋŋamba leero wiikendi ne mbagamba oba leero sikola omwana naŋŋamba ogeza Sebo tokola otulekeraani agenda ne mbakangamuko oluli nti ekyamazima ndabika ejange giwedde ku point FM mulima n'agugumuka n'agamba ogambye eki nkola nsimbi ikomawo
abakwata mu Foods Uganda batuuse Mubende bano be bokka begulidde erinnya okwetolola eggwanga Uganda mu kutunda obukoko obutuubu obw'omulembe obw'ennyama n'obw'amagi enkoko zino za mulembe nnyo era ng'ezo ennyama mu nnaku 35 zokka oba osala ate ng'ez'amagi zitandika okubiika ku myezi 4 gyennyini
bakuletedde n'enkoko ekika kya saso nga kw'ogatta n'emmere yakyo eyitibwa dual purpose ate nga olina n'ebika by'emmere y'enkoko byonna nga starter grower broilers concentrate dual purpose
kwata mu Foods Uganda tulina emmere y'enkoko eya buli kika ey'omulembe omuli ebirungo ebya buli kika n'emmere ey'obuweke kwata mu Foods Uganda bakuwa n'omusawo w'ebisolo ow'okuyambako kati bw'ayagala okutandika okulunda naawe alunda ng'enkoko zo zirwadde jako okukwata mu Foods Uganda bakuwa amagezi gwewe Mubende n'ebitundu ebiriraanyeewo basange ku Lubanga Road opposite Platinum Credit
oba bafune ku 0709 76 13 55 ne 0703 49
be bakwata mu Foods Uganda abakutuusiza obukoko obuto n'emmere y'enkoko eby'omulembe
Tolo mpale nakwayagala Events bano begulidde erinnya mu kutegeka emikolo n'okuyambako abo ababeera bagitegese. Golden Events balina sharing service nga bano be bantu abatendekeddwa obulungi ennyo okuyamba ku bateesiteesi b'omukolo. Tokkiriza mukolo gw'okufa olw'abooluganda bakuna ab'emikwano. Leeta aba Golden Events bakuyambeko okutambuza omukolo gw'obulungi. Kati gw'alina embaga, kwanjula, olina meetings oba omukolo gwonna nga weetaaga okuyambako mu kutuuza abantu, weekwate Golden Events. Bakola decorations ow'emikolo egy'enjawulo oba kuyita okutimba emikolo ku miwendo emisaamusaamu. Weetaaga ba MC oba bakatumwa. Golden Events ye kati gwateekateeka omukolo manya nti bw'okola ne Golden Events buli kimu kitambula bulungi nnyo. Balina tenti ezipangisibwa kussa n'obutebe ng'obasanga mu Bende ku Main Street. Osobola bakubira ku 0730 82 13 67 ne 0762 74 33 38. Golden Events, creating perfect memories.
Call Center beba kafulu era balina obumanyirivu mu kutuusiza sipeya w'obugaali ne pikipiki ate nga sipeya wabwe abeera oligino. Balina amayembe g'eggaali, empanka, frames, ebyoto ne sipeya omulala yenna owa changes ne maanyi ga kifuba. Ate bwe kituuka ku sipeya wa pikipiki oyagala mipiira, mpanka na buli sipeya alina gwe weetaaga owa buli kika kya pikipiki. Balina oyiro mu bika byonna ate nga bakuyambako n'okumukyusa. Balina bamakanika nga bano bakafulu mu kukanika obugaali ne pikipiki mu bika byonna. Olina Senke, Bajaj, Honda, TVS ng'owuliri kumazeeko emirembe kireete bagikanike. Nammwe abeetaaga amatundubaali mu sayizi zonna okugeza nga 40-40, 30-30, 24-30 kugatta n'obukutiya mu sayizi zonna ne mu bika byonna nga export n'obulala. Robert Bicycle Center basangibwa mu kibuga Mubende ku luguudo lwa Fast Link ekasaana okumpi n'enfuufu ku kalina empya mu maaso ga Fortbet. Ng'odda ku ayiwe okumanya ebisingawo bafune ku 0783 87 57 99 oba 0703 Gaga mwenda chenda nsambu musambu beba Robert Bicycle Center besigo vuga ekidduka kyo nga kiri talatibu.
Nkulaba wuliddwa w'emmwanyi zowona azikubira wona zitunda ku miwendo emirungi. Twongera ku mmwanyi ezaanikiddwa nga nkalu kati n'eddagala lyo twalifunye dda. Semco Coffee Factory Kasambya Kaweeri ku luguudo lw'Ekakumiro kilomita 5 okuva mu Mubende Town ne Semco Coffee Factory Kasambya Mubende mu Kasambya Town Council. Wubuuzireeta tujja kuziggulako. Tuweerabira akaceere kaffe kali akaalagirwa akasaagibwa wali ekiseekende ku kizimbe kya muzeeyi Mutyaba. Kano akaceere ka Semco kugatta n'akawunga Muntu tuwaleetedde ne Real Estate Mubende. Tugula ettaka ne tulisalasala mu puloti ne tuguza abantu baffe ku bbeeyi ennungi. Era ebyo byonna ojja bisanga ku offices za Semco. Oba kuba essimu 0786 154 999 oba 0752 458 965.
Bikole naye omukululo gw'ebikolwa byo tusigala tugulondoola. Wano mu programu omulongooti tulengera ebitalengerwa balala. Dakika zino ziri 11 zokka zibula okona saa zigenda kubeera 5 za kalasa mayanza mpuliriza munzikirize soke tulinye kakati ekidyeri bwe kiba ekidyeri tekitumala tulinye kakati namunkanga bwe bate tumala tulinye bombardier eya Uganda batugamba fly the crane to the pearl of Africa mpuliriza awo tuba tulinye kakati eya Uganda mpuliriza omubala gwaffe kugamba fly the crane to the pearl of Africa mpuliriza. Kakati ulire ebigambo bino tugeze mu namo ggwanga lya America tewakyali kulanga kulala. Tutandikidde ku interview ya Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert mukulembeze gwa kibiina ki NUP President akagamba abaana ba NUP bakagala nnyo. Agamba ta Sylvia wa Yesu Noah wako angambye nindeka agenda kumpa empologoma. Agambye lindako bagenda kumpa empologoma wano owulire. Dani Rutwama agambye sewajje nkuwadde ensawo ya sementi nze Dani Enamagogo. Dani Enamagogo enamba yange yiyo giraba waggulu ku live ensawo ya sementi oba ogireta wano ku Point FM mu mpeke obanga nsawo tetukulinaako obuzibu bw'oli kumpi. Weebale nnyo muganda wange Dani. Ampuliriza tuyingire kakati mudamu ggwanga lya USA kitugenda okubeera nga tutandika olunaku olwaliro. Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert bakira interview esookedde ddala bukyanga afulume eggwanga lya Uganda bwe mba seerabidde. Ani alinya mu network zange Jones ani alinya mu network zange ampuliriza
Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Bobi Wine Mitembo akoze interview ku mukutu gwa France 24 Okyanga afuluma munda mu ggwanga lya Uganda ng'ennaku z'omwezi yafuluma nnaku z'omwezi zaali leero 25 yafuluma mu nnaku z'omwezi zaali 13 nga zigenda kuwera 15 awo yafuluma 13 bwe mbaseerabidde ng'abuza ennaku 3 zokka okuweza emyezi ebiri Okyanga afuluma munda mu makaage ng'abadde mu kwekweka. Mpuliriza Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Bobi Wine agambye nti ekyamazima akadde konna ateekateeka okudda munda mu ggwanga lya Uganda wabula ebimu ku bigambo byayogedde ebirese yonna ng'ewuniikiridde akyogedde kiva mu kamwa ke n'ategeeza ensi nti ekyamazima nafuluma munda mu ggwanga lya Uganda naye nga nnyambibwako men in uniform ate nayita mulimu ku mawanga amanene mu East Africa lyesigenda kwogera. Mpuliriza Itungo Kole bw'agambye webale kuweereza webale kubeera ng'otumbudde agamba ati Honorable Farida w'amahoro Bigirimana oyo tava ku live ya Point FM buli Remba Nkula yangambye ekyamazima Freddy Sewajja n'okuwa sementi agamba ati muganda wange Sadi owa Sadi Updates ne Direct TV aye sebo yangamba sementi n'okubeera nga nkwazako ku charity. Mpuliriza tugenze wa Kyagulanyi Ssentamu ategeezezza ensi. Ampuliriza omwana wona agambye omutegedo Kireya Godwin Morgan bwatu bwagambye. Ampuliriza ebigambo bino Ticha agambye nti oli wakabi webale kubeera ng'ekyamazima osiima. Kyagulanyi Ssentamu ng'asinziira ku mukutu gwa France 24 interview eno gy'akoze olunaku olubadde olwajjo tutandise okugiraba ekyamazima nga zibadde ssaawa nga 10 obudde badde bwakawongezi. Ampuliriza Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu yongerako erya Mitembo eryo Ssaabasajja Kabaka yali muweera mu nkuuka yabagamba njagala mundeetere omwana wange Mitembo ajja nsanyuseemu tudasojjukira omwaka ogwo Sudda Ssaabasajja Kabaka ng'ali mu nkuuka yamuweera erinnya lya Mitembo. Ampuliriza Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert ayongedde ogenda maaso n'okubeera ng'ekyamazima bannayuganda n'abannakisinde ki NUP bannakibiina ki NUP bannakisinde ki People Power ayongedde kakati okubeera ng'ekyamazima abawe essuubi. Ampuliriza ategeezezza ensi nti ekyamazima okufuluma kwe munda mu ggwanga lya Uganda tiwabawo omuntu n'omu abalimba nti ekyamazima yayita ku Entebbe International Airport agambye tiwabawo omuntu n'omu abalimba. Nze Kyagulanyi Ssentamu sayitira ku Entebbe International Airport nalabyeko Dr. Fred Mukasambide mu kibiina ki DP amyuka Ssenkagale wa DP munda mu ggwanga lya Uganda ng'ategeeza nga Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert yayita ku kisaawe ky'ennyonyi Entebbe era mbulitaani tiketi ye eraga nti ajja kudda mu mwezi gwa 5 omwaka guno nga Mwami Museveni amaze okulayira. Kyagulanyi Ssentamu ssebo amaze okutegeeza ensi abagamba bannaye munveeko nze sayitira wadde ku Entebbe International Airport ensi gye yayitamu abadde kati neagyogere nga nange mbadde natera okujogera kubanza endabika nga gwe baali bagitegeeza wulira ebigambo bye bibino.
Hello and welcome to Tete à Tete here on France 24. Our guest this week is Robert Kyagulanyi. He's better known as Bobi Wine, a star singer turned politician.
Ampuliriza banjula ebitiibwa bya Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Mitembo Bobi Wine bitundu bya ggwanga lya Uganda naye ng'ali munda mu ggwanga lya America Washington DC lyesaza mwali. Ampuliriza bamwanjula ebitiibwa ng'omusajja amanyikiddwa ennyo nga Bobi Wine, musajja muyimbi, muwandiisi wa nnyimba, munnabyabufuzi, yakulira ekibiina ekisinga ababaka abangi ku ludda oluvuganya munda mu ggwanga lya Uganda. Ebitiibwa babimuwa. Mpuliriza France 24 gwe mukutu gwe tuliko. Ampuliriza.
After spending nearly 2 months in hiding after a contested presidential election, which he describes as tainted, in order to allow the re-election of Yoweri Museveni for a 7th term, Bobi Wine has resurfaced a few days ago in Washington, where he joins us from.
Mpuliriza bakutegeeza nti oluvannyuma lw'okumala ebbanga lya myezi kyenkana 2 ng'aliira ku nsiko oluvannyuma lw'akalulu akalondebwa nga naku z'omwezi 15 January 2026 munda mu ggwanga lya Uganda, Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu ekyamazima abadde ng'aliira ku nsiko wabula mu nnaku ezitali zawala yafuluma oba yeemulula n'abomba n'ava munda mu ggwanga lya Uganda n'ajja mu Washington era mukadde kano gy'asinzira okubeera ng'ekyamazima atwegattako lulimi Luzungu mukkirize kakati eyasomera ekiyuuya mu primary ku St. John's abavvuunulire nabagamba this is the reason as to why njagala kuddayo okukola charity eno y'emu ku nsonga kubanga Bampa Foundation ennungi singa teyali St. John's naalibadde nsobola okuvvuunula Oluzungu n'amazima ddala kakati tuddeyo mu Lungereza wamma tuluvvuunule bakyatunnyonnyola Kyagulanyi Ssentamu anayagala okulenya mu waya kale
Mark, and good morning or good afternoon.
Today wano nga bakyamwanjula.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Mark. Morning or good afternoon or good evening.
On July 15th, this presidential election took place. After that, you vanished. Can you tell us exactly what happened since?
Well, to be exact,
Ampuliriza babuuza Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu nti mu January 15 olwamaliriza okulonda akaluko bwa president wagenda maaso ate n'obulawo. You vanished. Tubuulire kiki ddala ekyakolera okubeera ng'ekyamazima obulawo.
I escaped from my home on the 16th of January, just one day after the election, following a raid on my house. I had earlier got information that there was a plan to harm me, and indeed when the military raided my house on the orders of General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, the son of
Ampuliriza ali ku Point FM radio 15 katonyeze mu bitundu bya Mubende. Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu ategeeza omukutu gwa France 24 nti ekyamazima oluvannyuma lw'akalulu 2026 amagye gasalako amakaaga ngenga gali ku orders zadumira amagye mu ggwanga lya Uganda ate First Son General Muhoozi Kainerugaba. Ekyamazima bwe nalaba nga amagye gasazeeko amakaaga nge ne neemulula mpola ne momba.
Museveni and the head of our military, I made my way out of my house, and I was in hiding for almost 2 months, following not private but public orders for my execution. Eventually, I was able to escape my country and resurface in Washington. But in between, my home was raided again and run over.
Ampuliriza Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Bobi Wine ategeeza omukutu gwa France 24 nti ekyamazima oluvannyuma lw'okubanga yafuna amawulire nti baagala kumusaanyaawo oba kuggyawo obulamu bwe. Ekigambo execution okiwulidde kiba kitegeeza kumusaanyaawo. Ampuliriza agamba nti ekyamazima yeemulula n'afuluma n'agenda munda mu ggwanga lya USA, eggwanga lya America, ali mu kibuga Washington. Naye agamba mu biseera ebyo nga avudde makaage ewaka nga yeekwese munda mu ggwanga lya Uganda, baddamu ne basalako amakaaga ate. Ampuliriza omwana wuno agamba Mubende going viral abali ku TikTok ekyamazima abaana bakiwanise. Omwana ze n'agamba tetuva wano, this is our radio now, you always share the truth, big up bro. Birungo bwatyo bwagambye. Ampuliriza gye bayita Point FM 15 katonyezemu nabagamba the reason as to why tukipinza relevance n'okubeera ng'ekyamazima tukyasobola okuyimirira abantu ne batugamba nti oyo Fred Sewajje, kwe kubeera ng'ekyamazima twogera ekituufu, kwe kubeera ng'ekyamazima twogera amazima. Okitegedde bulungi? Ampuliriza Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu akyali ku France 24 nkugambye message interview ebadde ya dakiika 11 ne seconds zino 12 yonna ngenda gikuwa bulambalamba.
My wife was assaulted and my family members, my wife ended up in hospital, and the military has been occupying my home since then.
But you were able to escape from them. Shows that maybe you were helped by some official, and maybe some in the regime are not totally in agreement with the order to go after you.
Ampuliriza bamubuuza nti owaayi tulaba ng'ekyamazima wafuluma era kino kiraga
Where I go, the common people risked their lives and families to house me, to feed me, and to clothe me, and to accommodate me. But most importantly, I had assistance from security people that I will not mention from within the regime, who are not in agreement with the way our country is being run.
Ampuliriza Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert mukulembeze wa kibiina ki NUP ategeeza ensi yagambye ekyamazima nga sibalimbye waliwo abanyambako mu regimu ya Mwami Museveni abo bennyini abatakkiriziganya na kunyigiriza abantu. Ensi neefa awo, ensi neefa. Wuliriza ebigambo bino, omwana atera ogamba ogundegunde ayi kyagu ogunde sebo tata tusensebuse ensi nesensebuka ampuliriza awo ensi nesensebuka omwana agambye bulijjo nsubwa omwana agambye what a nice speak ampuliriza ekyamazima gyaweta point fm agambye ekifaananyi ekiri ku tiktok baba kirungi nnyo nyini ddala ampuliriza Rashid's Transporters agambye ali mu kibuga Entebbe agambye baba webale kuweereza big up. Point FM is ever #1 radio nationwide in news representation. Thanks Daddy Princess. Walera abana mugenda kumeza amalala ate ebyo ebintu byemuwandiika binyiiza abantu mweze mbabuulira ebyo ebintu byemuwandiika binyiiza abantu mujja genano munyiiza abantu kale wama mpuliriza tutandikidde wa Kyagulanyi Center kakati wulira ebigambo bino Kyagulanyi Center ategeeza abakulu omukutu gwa France 24 n'ensi yonna interview ebadde mu luzungu ampuliriza kitegeeza ki nti buli nsi isobola okubeera ng'ekyamazima ligiraba wulira ebigambo bino ategeeza ensi nti ekyamazima sijja balimba nayambibwako abali mu regimu ya Mwami Museveni aba batakkanya ne byakunyigiriza bantu
to feed me and to clothe me and to accommodate me, but most importantly I had assistance from security people that I will not mention from within the regime who are not in agreement with the way our country.
Atutegeza nti no waliwo security people batagenda vayo nagenda maso nokubera ng'ekyamazima anokolayo obanga asinyako amannya gaabwe abo abatakkiriziganya na bya Mwami Museveni oba regime ya Mwami Museveni eyokulabika nga bibaali babalagira abaana bagamba tetujja kubikola babekamenga defiant yampuliriza ensi neeyongera okufa
being run, most importantly the way our military is being run by the son of the current president. So I was assisted and I was able to escape the country through one of the big countries that I will.
Wuliriza ebigambo bino Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu akisiinyako ategeeza nti ekyamazima nayambibwako ekyo sigenda kwekweka abagambye I was assisted nesobola okubeera nga nfuluma eggwanga lya Uganda nga mpita mu gamu ku mawanga amanene mu East Africa genda maaso nokubeera ng'ekyamazima njogera agambye yayita mulimu ku mawanga amanene mu East Africa gesigenda kubeera ng'ekyamazima njogera omwana ngambye sewajje baaba ekyamazima kasukaali keeko sabula tugendeze nani Luwizi abaana ba TikTok ekintu bakiwanise naye mwansubiza okumpa empologoma mumpe empologoma ngende ngule semiti ku ssomero lyange linasomera ku primary ekyo mbere nga nkimaze ampuliriza tukyali ku nsonga za Robert Kyagulanyi Center mu mnyambe mumpe eddakiika emu nkimanyi kakati we mukutte temwagala nseeseetuke naye n'obulango buno nnobujjawo munzikirize eddakiika emu yokka gye muba mumpa bataata mukkiriza abaana ba online n'abawuliriza mukkiriza eddakiika emu mugimpadde mumpe eddakiika emu Justin gyewo buno obulango bwokka kamu bubiri busatu buna bumala okuvawo nzije tweyongereyo nkugambye ensonga ziri nyenkandago Robert Kyagulanyi Center mu Bobi Wine Mitembo alabika nga ayongedde okulaga ensi nti ekyamazima he is a class above sea level ampuliriza abaana bali mugamba ogundegunde taata tusensebuse dakiika emu yokka nkomawo temuvaawo
abanya-Uganda inywena kamba njulire kasana soft drink kandi mu Uganda n'ensi yonna bamazeera okwikiriza nikyo ekyokunywa ekiroho ekyokunywa kino ekyakasana soft drink kirungi muno kandi nikiyamba obwomezi bwawe kikakakasibwa kandi bakiteekawo na sitampu aba UNBS kigenda mu maiso abantu ne bakinywa bakakiteekamu ebirungo ebyejjo ebyenzaalwa gamba nk'entangawuzi rosemary emicungwa obwoki enimu omunya-Uganda bw'okunywako okunywako akasana soft drink nikaleeta amaani mu mubiri nikakusengejja omubiri gwonna nikayihamu endwaire nikakuleetera appetite nikatamba senyiga abakusaasa ekifuba nikakusumura omubiri gwonna obwomezi nibugaruka buyaka kandi nikanura muno obwire bunu abanya-Uganda tebakyanya byokunywa bitakubayamba nibenywera kasana soft drink guruka mwa Dr. Kasana akokunywa kano tikakusorora nikanywebwa abato n'abakulu abakazi n'abasajja tikakusorora mu madini hamu n'enyikiriza zonna iwa yetaaga ekyokunywa kino kya kasana soft drink nikisangibwa mu maduuka gonna omu masupamaketi hamu n'omu madipoti okwetorola ihanga lyonna hamu n'ahandi wona abakutunda ebyokunywa okwenda kumanya bikusinga akasana soft drink rundi kikusuubura baterera esimu motoka ekikuyikyewo hazira 0 musanju munana ina nkaga na mukaga ana na musanju 25 rundi ya 0 musanju 05 atanu na ina nsanju na itanu ana na itanu kasana soft drink.
Cowboy Speciale, now available in affordable pouch packs of 25 grams, 50 grams, 100 grams, and 200 grams at your nearby shop. Cook delicious meals with Cowboy, a product of Bitco Uganda Limited.
abazadde amanya gange yenza sente gange yenza sente
tulina okukola ennyo ssente kubanga twanoonyeza zirwengi Rover mu kibuga ng'abaziina batono Amisi Kigundu muganda we Yasiini ne ŋŋamba bane nali zaagala ne ŋŋenda gigula nalabye abantu tebalina ssente tebalina na moroka
opposite ne Top City eri opposite ne Top City
ng'abaziina batono
169 ng'ojjanga tukolako ndooza bukalazi obulaba bukalazi weebuli bungi bukalazi weebuli at only 7,000 shillings at only 7,000 shillings only.
Zain Basravi in Dubai, thank you very much for the update, Zain. And Iran and its ally Hezbollah have been launching daily waves of strikes on Israel. Missiles and interceptions have been reported across several cities. On Tuesday, they killed at least one person and injured more than a dozen. Let's get an update on the situation in Israel with Nida Ibrahim, who's monitoring developments from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Nida, are we seeing any change in the intensity or targets in Israel?
Nice panties at only 7,000 shillings.
Well, we are seeing this change in intensity in
sample 7,000 shillings only. Musuka sample koka na we wangulira panty.
Disrupting the economy. Let's remember that when the Israeli home front tried to decrease the restrictions or lift the restrictions a little bit and ease them in terms of
gatherings, it had to revise these decisions and stop the return to gradual learning and keeping these flights coming out of Ben Gurion to a limited one plane per hour because of these continued Iranian-fired missiles. In addition to that, we are talking about Hezbollah also sometimes launching joint attacks with Iran that in its own is causing an overwhelm in the aerial defense systems. And we've seen that particularly yesterday where 4 at least ballistic missiles have not been intercepted. And according to Israeli media, they fell in what they call open areas. That usually means non-residential areas, but it also shows the difficulty that the aerial defense systems are facing, not just in detecting these missiles ahead of time, but also sometimes because they have these fragmenting warheads that have bomblets that can splinter and go into so many faraway areas that even if they are intercepted, they are still able to cause damage, as we've seen yesterday in Tel Aviv, as we've seen yesterday in Ramat Gan. All of this is being weighed in Israel as the Israeli estimates suggest that the Iranians still have 11,000 rockets and missiles that they're still getting ready to fire into Israel, while the Israeli officials are saying they want to keep lobbying for an extension of the war, while acting as if the war would end very soon because of the latest remarks by President Trump. And they believe that there's a real interest by President Trump to decrease tension and reach a deal with Iran. Whether Iran will accept the American terms, the Israelis believe that's really up to be decided, and it's not clear. But at the same time, they're still lobbying, they're still interested in keeping the pressure up on Iran by targeting ballistic missile launchers, as well as what they believe are nuclear facilities that have not been hit until now.
Nida, thank you for the updates. Nida Ibrahim reporting there live from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Elsewhere in Iraq, the latest attack in western Anbar province targeting facilities of the Popular Mobilization Forces has killed at least 7 people and wounded 20 others. Iraq's defense ministry says the U.S. airstrike targeted a base used by the PMF and military personnel. The brigade's headquarters in the same area was struck on Tuesday, killing at least 15 fighters, including senior leaders. Well, we just reported this that Iraqi security forces say airstrikes hit the sites used by the Popular Mobilization Forces in Anbar. Assad Beg is joining us for an update. What do we know happened in this new attack on the PMF in Western Anbar? Assad.
Yes, this just comes days after 15 PMF fighters were killed. Now, this time, it seems that this site in western Iraq was hit by an American aircraft. You can see images of the aircraft flying low. What we understand from the military here is that airstrikes were carried out and then further strikes carried out on that same position on this joint PMF military site. Now, it's important to note that the Popular Mobilization Forces technically come under the military, and factions within the PMF, some are aligned to Iran and have been carrying out attacks against American bases and interests and assets in the country. But we have seen an escalation in terms of the PMF being targeted. Now, this seems to be at least the first time that both the PMF and the Iraqi military have been hit. It could just be that the Iraqi military have been caught up in this attack, but nevertheless, the latest information that we have is that 7 people have been killed and at least 20 injured. In recent days, we've heard the Iraqi government come out and condemn any attacks against the Popular Mobilization Forces. They've been described as a pillar of the state. They were involved in the fight against ISIS, and after that, they were incorporated into the Iraqi military security apparatus. So again, increasingly, Iraq is becoming a battlefield between these Iraqi armed factions and the United States.
Assad, thank you for that. Assad Beg, live for us there in Baghdad. Let's discuss all these latest developments further now with Zaydoun Al-Kinani, founding director of the Arab Perspectives Institute. Good to have you back, Zaydoun. As we see now, this conflict within the US, Israel, and Iran is not just between those 3 countries, but a regional one in Iraq, in Lebanon. We're just having the Spanish Prime Minister now saying that the Israelis, Israel's Netanyahu, wants to inflict on Lebanon the same destruction as in Gaza. How will the outcome of whatever is decided between the Americans and the Iranians, Israelis, affect the crises in the rest of the region, whether in Iraq or Lebanon?
Significantly, but the transitionary period that was already in planning in a future post-Hezbollah or in a future post the Iran-aligned factions within the PMF was already on the table. It might get much more intensified based on the results that might erupt from the war with Iran. The communities and the agencies that would have hoped for a much more limited political involvement of the Iran proxies in the region, whether that's Iraq or Lebanon or beyond, would imagine that a US-Iran deal coming out of this war would make these hopes and imaginations much more decreased, given that a survival of the Iranian regime after everything it went through for the past month would be seen as a symbolic achievement that it can use as a regional confidence to maintain its proxy influence. Much more less for sure, but it will definitely make it stronger than before in the region.
But we're nowhere near a US-Iran deal yet, despite Donald Trump saying that negotiations are underway, the Iranians denying this, of course. Is there real diplomacy going on right now, or is it just an extension of battlefield strategy?
Well, the way the war looks like and the status quo of it, we're certainly not anywhere near a deal. But if we were to compare the conditions that Trump had presented from the first day, which is a complete surrender, to proposing points that were not completely eliminated from the Iranian political mindset, it seems like we are closer to a deal than ever. There's certainly an American realization of the consequences of what an economic warfare towards the Gulf region and how it translates to the global economy.
Yeah, the UN Human Rights Chief just this hour saying that there's $63 billion in economic losses as a result of this conflict, which is huge.
It's huge, and that's from the UN perspective, which is trying to look at it from an international perspective. We have countries such as the Philippines, which is going through a detrimental economic crisis with the fuel prices. Winter, if this war would lead, God forbid, in the next few months, a winter gas crisis might erupt in Europe, which might make it even detrimental for these European allies to push against the US, which would already be facing the pressures of the midterm elections to find an end to the war. Trump is trying to buy time to ensure that the war doesn't end without a symbolic achievement that he could sell it back to the American media.
So what do you see as militarily achievable right now in the short term, and what would be an acceptable end of state for either side in this conflict?
the Iranian regime is openly and publicly making sure that it wants to ensure security guarantees. As much as it may not trust it in the long term, it wants a much more stronger international institutional involvement to ensure that it could prevent such a conflict from happening in the future. But realistically speaking, even if those security guarantees were to be put on the table, one cannot deny that Israel might work unilaterally in its regional conflict towards Iran in the future. If US were no longer to take the front seat in this war, Israel has been doing its own type of agendas in the region beyond the acceptance and the approvals, whether it were to follow the international law or international institutions. But given the economic crisis, given the global economy that is reflecting the challenges this is presenting to the rest of the world, it seems like the Strait of Hormuz is the triggering point here.
Right.
Whether the US will be able to present economic solutions to the countries and the economies that have been impacted by the limited passage of the Strait of Hormuz, or will it continue to be a monopolized political leverage by the Iranian regime?
Zaidoun, what about the Gulf states? Where does this all leave them? Once this conflict is over, it will end eventually. Where will their strategic positioning go? I mean, they've had good relations with the US. Some have also had good relations with Iran. Where will that leave them?
Well, they'll have to revisit a lot of the calculations that were regarding their existential threat in the region. They're going through a very strong, delicate act between a permanent geographical neighbor, but also a long-standing partner for the past few decades, such as the United States. One cannot deny that there will be a lot of questioning to the level of trust if it were to be maintained with the United States. But we also cannot deny that the Trump administration is also a very unique administration that may not translate and reflect the overarching political institutional agenda in the region. But also one interesting element, a unique element that may have erupted from this war is a very strong political consciousness across the Gulf states in planning a future which is much more unified and collective despite their minor differences.
All right. Thank you so much for talking to us about this. Always good to get your thoughts. Zaidoun Al-Kinani joining us on Al Jazeera. In other developments, the global benchmark oil price dropped back below $100 a barrel on Wednesday, indicating that markets are more hopeful that the conflict won't be prolonged. Stock markets in Asia rose slightly after President Trump said there was progress in efforts to negotiate an end to the war. Tokyo's Nikkei was up more than 2%. South Korea's Kospi and Taiwan's TEX gained 3%. Let's get the latest on the Asian markets with Laura Westbrook, who's in Hong Kong. So, Laura, oil prices first. Tell us about how they're doing.
Well, markets here in Asia have been responding positively to the reports that a possible ceasefire is in the works. Oil prices dropped to in and around $100 a barrel for Brent crude, and stock markets here in Asia also responding positively to those comments by Donald Trump, and they are mostly up in response. But experts say there is still a lot of unknowns where this actually goes and whether there is anything material in terms of a ceasefire. This conflict is still ongoing. There's a lot of uncertainty that remains. We know that things can change and they can change quickly. There is still that significant blockage in the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran controls. And so while there is optimism in Asian markets, it does remain cautious, and experts say that the prospect of talks, whether
Laura, I'm going to interrupt you. Sorry, we're going to go to the UN Human Rights Council, where the Iranian representative is speaking at that emergency session called by the UAE.
Do not embolden Israel by targeting Iran and only Iran in political and legal fora. It is a historic mistake. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
Let's just hear it a little bit. I mean, we should have gone to it earlier. All right, we caught the end of the Iranian representative's statement at the UN Human Rights Council. which is having an emergency session today on the war in this region, the war on Iran by the US and Israel, an emergency session which was called by the United Arab Emirates. We've heard briefly from the Iranian representative there. We've also heard earlier from the UN Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, who called for an end of the war and on all parties to end attacks on civilian infrastructure in the region, saying that the economic losses are huge for the region, $63 billion in economic losses. We'll keep an eye on what's happening there in Geneva and bring you the latest statements from the representatives there. A reminder of the latest developments in the conflict now that is now in its 26th day. A top Iranian military spokesman has dismissed reports that talks are underway with the U.S., saying Washington is negotiating with itself. That's as President Trump insists that sides are negotiating and that Iran has agreed it will never have nuclear weapons. There's been no let-up in U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran. At least 12 people have been killed in the south of Tehran. The Red Crescent says a residential area was targeted. And stock markets in Asia rose slightly on Wednesday after President Trump insisted talks to end the war are underway. Tokyo's Nikkei was up more than 2%. Oil prices have also fallen, indicating that investors are more hopeful the conflict will end soon. Elsewhere in India, police have been deployed to petrol stations in some parts of the country to manage crowds as fears grow about fuel shortages. Officials say there is enough petrol, but many motorists remain unconvinced. India imports around 90% of its crude oil, more than half of it from Gulf countries. India has negotiated with Iran to allow its tankers to sail through the Strait of Hormuz after being stuck for days. It has increased purchases from Russia since the U.S. temporarily lifted sanctions on it. M.K. Venu is the founding editor of The Wire. That's an independent online news platform. He explains why India will feel the pinch more than other Asian states that rely heavily on energy imports.
India is probably most vulnerable among the Asian economies. I'll give you the reason. India's strategic petroleum reserves are less than a week, whereas China's, for instance, is, I'm told it's 5 months, 6 months. China is far better prepared. And India also, India imports about 88% of its oil requirements. And the fear of inflation, many economists say that if this situation continues and the Strait of Hormuz remains blocked, and if 20% of the oil is off the market, India's GDP could suffer by 1% percentage to 1.5 percentage points. So that will be a setback. And the other setback could be that India is also vulnerable on its balance of payments. You know, in the last, even before the war, because of Trump's, havoc caused by Trump's trade deals, India was not getting enough foreign investments and not getting enough dollar supplies. And it was expending a lot of its foreign exchange to keep its currency stable. Now, there is an instability of currency issue also in India, which was there before the war. It has got aggravated much more after the US-Iran war.
The Philippines says it's working with the U.S. to secure waivers that will allow it to obtain oil from countries sanctioned energy emergency. The government says it has around 45 days of fuel supply, but President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said in a televised address that his government is looking for other sources so that supply will not run out. The Philippines imports almost all of its crude from the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia being its biggest supplier. While in the northern Philippines, those costs are being felt in agricultural heartlands critical to the nation's food supplies, where farmers say they're now paying the price. Al Jazeera's Jamila Alindogan reports from Benguet province.
It's 7 a.m. here in Atok in Benguet province in the northern Philippines, one of the country's main vegetable-producing regions. We joined farmers as they began harvesting cabbage from their fields. This is meant to be a season of return, a time when effort is rewarded. But not this time. Farmers here say they are harvesting at a loss, the worst they have seen in years. Cabbage that once sold for 50 Philippine pesos or less than a US dollar is now expected to fetch a fraction of that. Harvesters earn the equivalent of just $3 a day. So farmers face a difficult choice. Harvest what they can or leave their crops to rot where they grow.
What we are going through now is worse than the pandemic. At least then,
we could still determine prices. It's really terrible.
What's unfolding here is tied to events far beyond these mountains. The U.S.-Israel war on Iran has pushed global fuel prices higher, costs that travel across borders and land here.
We are now on our way to a town called Trinidad. That's where the Farmers Center and trading posts are. That's about 2 hours from Atok town. The cost of fuel here has nearly doubled, and the price of transport is shouldered by the farmers.
The government says there is enough fuel reserves until early May. And at this trading post, people say they know very well what is happening in the Middle East and how decisions made far away can quickly ripple into everyday life here. And yet, they say they do not panic. Instead, there is a sense of quiet resolve. Farmers here point out that these mountains have fed millions for generations. And that is why they will carry on. Jamela Alindogan, Al Jazeera, Benguet Province, Northern Philippines.
The U.S.-Israeli war on Iran has also caused a shortage of jet fuel. It's affecting many airlines across Africa, which have announced fare increases. Famida Miller reports from Johannesburg.
About 70% of jet fuel and kerosene imports to Africa flow via the Strait of Hormuz. Now, since the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran began, shipping of fuel from refineries in the Middle East through that strait has almost entirely stopped. Now, for consumers buying air tickets, that means higher fuel surcharges. Airlines are also struggling to manage volatile costs as fuel gets more scarce. The higher prices have affected Europe and Asia as well, but African carriers may feel those increases even more. Jet fuel across the continent typically accounts for anywhere between 30 and 45% of operating costs. Now that's compared to a global average of 20 to 25%. And Africa has limited refining capacity. In South Africa, only 2 crude oil refineries are operating. Some airlines based here in South Africa have raised their ticket prices by introducing a temporary fuel surcharge. Others say they have enough fuel for perhaps a month or two and are taking a wait-and-see approach.
What our airlines do, generally speaking, from a strategy point of view, is really to try and absorb the cost as much as they can before they can even think about passing them to consumers. The point where you see the ticket prices going high, surcharges being introduced by airlines, is really to try and maintain sustainability of the industry so that you don't end up having to bear all the costs as airlines.
Meanwhile, motorists here are bracing for a significant increase in petrol and diesel prices, and that's from April. It could be one of the steepest monthly hikes in recent years. Now, early estimates suggest petrol could increase by anywhere between 18 and 30 US cents per liter. And a weaker local currency, the rand, is not making things any easier. Projected prices for petrol could reach the equivalent of about $1.50. But South Africa's government says there's no immediate threat to supply and that South Africa has sufficient strategic fuel reserves in place. They don't want people to panic buy, saying that could create unnecessary shortages. Famida Miller, Al Jazeera, Johannesburg, South Africa.
The U.S.-Israeli war on Iran is threatening to push food prices even higher across vulnerable nations. The conflict has disrupted fertilizer shipments and sent energy prices soaring. Lebanon's economy was already struggling, and under Israel's recent bombardment, it's set to feel the shock even more. Tony Cheng has more from Beirut.
For Aziza Khalil, a trip to the shops is all about tough decisions. A widow with 3 children, the surge in prices means even the basics are now sometimes out of reach. As she tries to fill her trolley with bargains, she just can't make ends meet.
Example, whatever used to cost 50 now costs 100. What was 200 is now 400. It's unbearable. Whether it's vegetables or chicken or meat or canned goods, it's all the same. The shops say they can't do anything. They just blame the suppliers.
An Israeli airstrike hits the southern city of Tyre. Similar attacks across southern Lebanon have forced hundreds of thousands of people to flee. The damage to infrastructure, industry and trade, and the cost of dealing with the displaced population is estimated at $100 million a day. The rise in fuel prices caused by the war is disastrous for a country that relies on imported goods. And that's forcing other costs to rapidly rise. Since the currency crisis of 2019, Lebanon's government has little control of an economy that runs on the US dollar. The COVID-19 crisis, port explosion, and the 2023-24 war have further compounded their economic woes. Some believe this crisis is so serious it's no longer an economic issue, but an existential one.
To be honest, and trying not to be pessimistic, we have hit rock bottom. If this continues, we will go into a social disaster, and at this point, Lebanon will be under a major risk of existence.
And while the middle classes may have enough to ride out the storm, others are struggling to survive.
There are now 1 million people who've been displaced across Lebanon, forced from their homes with very little chance of getting back anytime soon. And as prices continue to surge, these are the people that are going to feel it most. Tony Cheng, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
The Israeli attacks on Lebanon have targeted critical bridges that link southern Lebanon to the rest of the country. Umi Kulsum Sharif explains.
Israel has declared it wants to control large parts of southern Lebanon to create what it calls a buffer zone. Now, the Israeli defense minister says the military wants to occupy land right up to the Litani River. That's nearly 30 kilometers deep inside Lebanon. So it basically wants 1/10 of Lebanese land from villages to fertile agricultural land. Now, the Israeli military has destroyed at least 6 bridges along the Litani River in less than 2 weeks. This includes the Kasmieh Bridge that connects capital Beirut further up to the southern largest city of Tyre. Now, the Israeli military accuses Hezbollah of using these bridges to move fighters and push weapons into southern Lebanon.
All right, interrupting that report to take you back to the UN Human Rights Council, where the Qatari representative is speaking.
The member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, launched by Iran, with grave repercussions that are not only affecting peace and security in the world, but also human rights. We firmly condemn the attacks by drones and missiles. Such attacks have undermined our territorial integrity, violating the UN Charter, including the principle of not using force or threatening to use it. These strikes, which have targeted civilians or civilian infrastructure, amount to a gross violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Vital infrastructure such as airports and ports have been targeted, as have water desalination plants. These do not pose this poses a threat to the region's security and also violates human rights law. These attacks amount to a great source of concern for us, and we can no longer remain silent. We have been affected by ballistic missile strikes and rocket strikes. This has caused victims among civilians and undermined the water and power supply services, thereby threatening the right to safety and life. To attack the electricity and desalination plants also involves serious environmental consequences and undermines rights that are guaranteed by human rights provisions. Such measures threaten the lives of the most vulnerable, including women and children. It makes their lives more difficult and violates the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. President, the targeting of maritime ways, including the Strait of Hormuz, are a source of great concern, given the dire consequences they can have on the economy and supply routes. It also has an impact on the enjoyment of economic and social rights and the right to development in a number of states, including in developing countries. We therefore would like to recall that to protect navigation and civilian infrastructure is a moral and ethical duty that must not be undermined. Blocking the strait cannot advance the settlement of the situation in any way. And to attack a state that is not a party to the conflict and which has not allowed use of its territory in the hostilities is a violation of international law and undermines international peace and security. We have dissociated ourselves from the outset from this war, and we have refused to be part of the escalation. However, Iranians continue to target us and other neighboring countries too, thereby undermining international peace and security. We would like to reiterate the inherent right of countries to defend themselves, the legitimate right to self-defense in keeping with the UN Charter and international law. My country would like to commend the UN Security Council resolution, which firmly condemned attacks against the Gulf states and Jordan. These attacks constitute a violation of international law and threaten international peace and security. We would like to reaffirm that the necessary reparation must be provided to the affected states and affected civilians. The state of Qatar, President, considers that human rights, peace, security and development are interdependent elements. To assault one affects the others. That is why the handling of this crisis requires a comprehensive approach in order to strengthen peaceful solutions. We call for an immediate end to the escalation, for a return to political efforts, and for dialogue to prevail so as to safeguard human dignity. We call on the Human Rights Council to shoulder its responsibilities by supporting this resolution and by closely monitoring these violations, and to take all necessary measures so as to protect human rights and avoid any repetition. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, President. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would like to thank the Council for meeting our request to hold an urgent debate. We condemn the attacks by Iran against our kingdom and the member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, as well as Jordan. These are states that are not parties to the current conflict, and these Iranian attacks amount to a gross violation of state sovereignty, of their territorial integrity. They violate the UN Charter and international law. President, we must call things by their name. To target a neighbor is a violation of the principles of good neighborly relations. To target the mediator betrays all efforts aimed at peace and undermines any constructive initiative. To target states that are not party to the hostilities amounts to unacceptable and unjustifiable attacks that cannot be passed over in silence. Iranian attacks represent an approach that is based on the use of militia, the attack of neighboring countries in order to undermine stability. These attacks, which seek to undermine the region's peace and stability, represent a gross violation of international law and pose a direct threat to international peace and security. Iran's attacks are aimed at claiming civilian lives, and they have targeted civilian infrastructure and energy infrastructure, which is a gross violation of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We have heard attempts by Iran to evade all responsibility, and yet you cannot deny what the world clearly sees. Iran cannot escape responsibility here. To continue to follow the same approach will lead Iran nowhere. It will merely further isolate the country. My kingdom would like to recall that Iran should review its methods and end its attacks, because continuing attacks against neighboring countries would not bring any benefits in the conflict to Iran. We condemn Iran's attacks against commercial vessels in the Gulf and the suspension of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, which is having an impact on the region and the rest of the world, and which worsens the economic situation at the international level while having an impact on most vulnerable countries, including the least developed countries and poorest countries. We would like to recall that attacks against energy infrastructure and supply chains, especially as regards food goods, also has an impact on the global situation. Finally, President, silence is not a choice. This Council must take all necessary measures so as to address these unjustified Iranian attacks while preserving protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. My kingdom calls for states to support and co-sponsor draft resolution L38. We would like to express our deepest gratitude to those states that have expressed their support for this draft resolution. We are working with the core group to engage in consultations with all states so as to agree on wording that can garner consensus and reflect the position of the international community in the face of these attacks by Iran. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس تواصل بلادي الإمارات العربية.
We have been listening there to a special emergency session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, a special session which was called by the United Arab Emirates on the war in the region and the attacks, more specifically by Iran on Gulf countries. We heard from the UN Human Rights Chief earlier, who called on the attacks on civilian infrastructure in the region to continue. We also heard from the Qatari representative, Hind Abdurrahman Al-Mufta, the permanent representative of the state of Qatar to the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva, to the UN office in Geneva, I should say. She said that to attack a state that is not a party to the conflict and that does not allow its territory to be used in the conflict is a violation of international law, a grave violation, she said. And she said that attacks on airports, desalination plants, and electricity infrastructure is also a grave violation of the human rights of the citizens and residents of the region. We also heard from the Saudi representative, Abdul Mohsen Majed bin Khotaila, who talked about the attacks on the region, condemning Iran's attacks on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and GCC countries, saying that Iran cannot escape responsibility for these attacks and that the Human Rights Council must take measures to address the unjustified Iranian attacks. We'll keep a close eye on what's happening in Geneva today and bring you the latest here on Al Jazeera. Well, the war on Iran has also renewed criticism of laws for asylum seekers and migrants in Sweden. Teenagers are being deported to the Middle East, Africa, and beyond, despite growing up with their families in Scandinavia. The Swedish government has come under pressure as the centre-right coalition aims to retain power in this year's general election. Paul Rees reports from Stockholm.
Ilya Tahareki arrives early to open up his mother's hairdressing business in Stockholm. He's been in Sweden since the age of 8, when his family fled Iran. He's grown up speaking Swedish as well as feeling Swedish. After years of temporary residency, he then got a message from the Swedish authorities when he turned 18. Utvisning, deportation. Being an adult meant he was no longer considered a dependent of his Swedish resident mother and would be sent back to Iran.
I don't speak the language. I haven't been raised like them, so I don't even know how to talk. A lot of teenagers have already been deported to other countries. I don't think anyone morally would say this is a good situation or, oh, we meant to do it this way.
The Aftonbladet newspaper in Stockholm is investigating the fate of dozens of young people being deported to Syria, Somalia, Iran and elsewhere.
Artist who works in a hospital.
They can be deported if their permanent residence hasn't been approved by the time they turn 18, even if one of their parents is a Swedish resident.
Swedish migration policies has been tightened for many years now, and there has not been any rage about that. But now suddenly the story is about their friends, people who are one of us, and then reactions and feelings have been very strong about this.
This has led to a pause in deportations while authorities try to change direction. The government has responded by saying it will try to create what it's calling a legal safety valve to stop the deportation of teenagers in cases where the consequences would be unreasonable. But teenagers whose deportation was already decided are still being detained pending their removal. The exact number to have already left is still not clear.
We have found out over 90 cases of teen deportations from last year, but it's probably much more. Over 2,000 people that were between the age 18 and 21 got the refusal from staying in Sweden.
Some families had to endure their children being sent back to Iran just before the war started. While the conflict has gone on, Ilya has been in limbo.
They haven't been able to handle the migration policy correctly, and currently you have a situation where they're overcorrecting it and making it so strict to the point where all the good things that come out of migration are just being taken away.
Sweden may now have to reflect on the freedom and shelter being taken away from those it once vowed to help. Paul Rees, Al Jazeera, Stockholm.
Let's take a look at some of the day's other news now. And in Gaza, water has become more than a daily necessity. It is a daily struggle. Families now wait for hours just to fill a few containers, while doctors warn polluted water is fueling a growing health crisis. Hani Mahmoud reports from Gaza City.
Under the winter sun, Palestinians in Gaza gather around water trucks, holding empty containers, waiting. For many neighborhoods, they are now the only reliable source of water. Israel's war destroyed large sections of Gaza water infrastructure. Pipelines were hit, pumping stations stopped working, and heavy machinery needed for repairs were damaged. Yassin Water Station was once a lifeline for thousands. Now, the facility is barely functioning.
The occupation has destroyed more than 72 water wells in Gaza City. Over 150,000 meters of water networks have been destroyed, along with 4 main reservoirs. The water system has been absolutely devastated.
Behind me is what remains of one of Gaza's main water facilities. Officials say the damage here alone has left tens of thousands without a stable access to clean water. And without equipment and spare parts, repairs are moving slower than needed. The United Nations says around 70% of Gaza water system is currently disrupted. Repairs to the Makarot water supply lines have stalled. It lies east of the so-called Yellow Line, where Israeli forces remain deployed. Israel classifies many components needed to repair water and sanitation systems as dual use. That means they can be blocked from entering Gaza on security grounds. Municipal teams say they are working with what they can find.
These pipes, connectors and fittings are essential for maintenance work. We are searching the outskirts of the city for whatever materials we can find and recycling them for repairs.
Doctors say the crisis is causing dehydration, kidney complications, and waterborne diseases.
Water contamination severely affects patients' health. It contains high levels of salts, nitrates, phosphorus, and sulfur.
For residents here, the crisis is measured in hours spent waiting, children carrying heavy buckets, and patients whose condition worsen with every sip of unsafe water. With most crossings, including Rafah, reportedly closed since Israel's war with Iran, the flow of supplies faces further strain. Until repairs can be carried out, access to clean water depends on the next arriving truck. Hani Mahmoud, Al Jazeera, from Gaza City, Palestine.
The U.S. state of Minnesota is suing the federal government after January's immigration enforcement operations there. The state is seeking access to the cases of U.S. citizens Renee Nicole Good and Alex Pretty. Federal immigration agents shot and killed them at separate protests in January. The lawsuit accuses the Department of Justice and Homeland Security of blocking state investigators from evidence. A U.S. national who had been detained in Afghanistan for more than a year is on his way back home. Dennis Coyle, a linguist and researcher, landed in the UAE hours after the Taliban government announced his release. His family had written to the government asking he be pardoned for the Muslim holiday of Eid. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has welcomed his release and thanked Qatar and the UAE for their support. We are going to take a short break. Rishad Salama is with you next with more of the day's news, including the latest developments in the U.S.-Israel war on Iran. Do stay with us.
Americans, they don't have any clear image and plan of what to do.
The logic behind this is to eliminate the nuclear weapons program, to eliminate Iran's support for terrorism.
The Israelis do not want to have opening of political talks between Tehran and Trump.
Stay with Al Jazeera for the latest developments.
I'm at a fuel station in Belgium where motorists from the Netherlands are queuing to save money on gas. Scenes like these can be found across Europe, where fuel tourism has spiked since the war on Iran.
Prices have increased up to 20% since the Strait of Hormuz has been practically closed for oil shipments.
The Netherlands has among the highest excise tax on fuel in Europe, and the price of petrol has now hit around $2.50 per liter. And this is the price in Belgium for petrol. It's now 1.749, which is around $2 per liter. So filling up the car here can save people tens of dollars.
Everybody, I'm Rashad Salamat. This is Al Jazeera coming to you live from Doha. You're watching our extensive coverage of the US-Israel war with Iran.
We're actually talking to the right people, and they want to make a deal so badly. You have no idea how badly they want to make a deal.
A top Iranian military spokesperson dismisses reports talks are underway with the US, saying Washington is, quote, negotiating with itself. No let-up in the US and Israeli attacks on Iran. At least 12 people are killed in southern Tehran. Iran is launching several attacks against Israel in retaliation. Missiles and interceptions have been reported. The UN human rights chief and countries of the Middle East are condemning the war in the region. Long queues outside fuel stations across India. Public anger mounts after fears of shortages. Iran's military has pledged to keep fighting despite President Donald Trump saying both sides were talking. Iran's Central Command has denied this and says the US is negotiating with itself. A military spokesperson said there will be no compromise, and Tehran, not Washington, will decide when the situation returns to, quote, the way it was.
Do not call your defeat an agreement. The era of your promises is over. Today, the world has two fronts, truth and falsehood. And every freedom-seeking person will not be deceived by the waves of your media. Has the level of your internal conflicts reached the point where you are negotiating with yourselves? There will be no sign of your investments in the region, nor will you see the previous prices of energy and oil until you understand this. Stability in the region is guaranteed by the powerful hand of our armed forces. Stability comes through power.
But Donald Trump insists talks are underway. He says Iran has agreed it will never have nuclear weapons, but despite the apparent diplomatic efforts, several thousand US troops are being deployed to the region. And those reports of diplomacy have not stopped attacks across the Middle East. Central Israel and the Iranian capital have been targeted in recent strikes. Gulf countries have also been heavily targeted in this war. The UN Human Rights Council is discussing the impact of that after Gulf nations called for an urgent meeting in Geneva. There was criticism of Iran's attacks, while Tehran blamed Israel for the chaos in the region.
Israel is not merely attacking Iran, nor solely striking at Lebanon, nor even undermining Palestine. It is assaulting the very fabric of regional order and dragging the entire world toward chaos and peril.